Hello, everyone. Welcome to a mini BP debate that is hosted by the JOVED Orcom for the purpose of giving something to our sponsor, Telkom Indonesia. In government bench, we have Yoshi Miriano and Yahwista Salomo, and in opposition bench, we have Leonardus Hans and Marvin Tandi. The motion in this house is this house as a millennial would work in a startup rather than a traditional company. Without further ado, we call upon the Prime Minister to open this debate. Here.
Okay, am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
Okay, I'm going to start. Oh yeah, a little bit of a disclaimer. Tolong kalau if anyone wants the POI, just open the mic. Don't chat me because I won't be able to see it. Okay, I'm starting in 3, 2, 1. Ladies and gentlemen, as millennials, we find that working at startups provide a gateway towards better job security. First of all, I'm going to start with a disclaimer. Two things. First of all, is that this debate is not about whether or not we should argue if this is better for the welfare of the nation or for the welfare of the most vulnerable people. This is talking about whether we as millennials would be better off working in a startup or rather a traditional company. The focus is on us. So the burden of the government team is to prove to you that millennials are better off, or the benefits to the millennials offset the cons of working in a startup rather than a traditional company. The second thing is that we are talking about the startup companies that are still small, not the unicorns like Gojek or Grab or Shopee. We're talking about the new, probably a few months old or maybe even a year or 2 years old startup companies, which are yet to be noticed by the larger masses. Okay, that said, first of all, I'm going to talk about why job security is very crucial to millennials. And this is the foundation of our argument. Two key features on this. First of all, millennials live in a time where wages are stagnant while productivity has risen. What I'm trying to say is that basically we're being unpaid laborers. Millennials are being asked to do more and more of their jobs while their wages have stayed constant. And add salt to the injury, the second thing is that the living conditions has not risen up while the prices of renting, of food, of everything, basically they have inflated. And that actually creates a far more dangerous and uncertain living conditions for millennials. Rather, contrast that to the 1950s for the baby boomers. You should see that houses are at an all-time low. Families are earning more than the average millennials right now, and then the world is basically not at all that volatile. The political situation right now is very volatile. The Trump and China trade wars, the recent annexation of Crimea by Russia, the standoff in the Aegean Sea between Turkey and Greece. Basically, the whole world has gone to hell. All this creates a very unstable source for millennials where big companies are threatened and therefore they are unable to pay for these millennials, therefore creating a far less stable job security. Millennials are left having to fend off for themselves. This is very important. So the second thing that I'm going to do, I'm going to talk about why traditional companies do not provide adequate job security. First of all, there is a general shift towards automation in big companies. What does this mean? This means that big companies are more easily able to fire millennials. Why? Two reasons. First of all, is that automation, despite the high capital investment required, it adds to the profile of the company in two things. First of all, it adds to the PR of the company by trying to say that, okay, we are going to modernize. No, thank you. We're going to modernize. And here we are. We are the patrons of technology. It's a good thing because technology is something that is seen as good by the people. The second thing is that these companies are able to have a far less maintenance, a far less cost in maintaining these processes. So rather than paying wages, they're just paying for the machinery, even though if the initial capital investment is large. The second thing about the shift towards automation, why they are more susceptible, why these millennials are more susceptible to be fired, because these millennials basically they're just college graduates with maybe a year or two of job experience. That means that they're basically pawns and they're easily fired because they don't have much say in the company. They're the first to be laid off in any big recession. And take a look that in the span of about 20 years, we already have two recessions. One, the 2008 world recession. Now, the corona pandemic. This is a very large thing that cannot be ignored, that creates a very uneven playing field for these millennials. So what I'm trying to say, even if the companies do not fire you right now, the general trend is for repetitive, rigid, and specialized jobs in traditional companies, and this is the norm in traditional companies, are going to be replaced more and more by AI and automation as technology goes on and on. Take a look at dock workers. More and more of their job is being taken over by machinery. Car making, more and more of them are being taken over by machinery. Before I continue, yes?
Why do you think blue collar worker, like what you characterize, able to work in startup company that literally need IT degree first before you can able to work in there?
Okay, this actually transitions nicely to my third thing that I'm going to say. The third argument is that I'm going to tell you why startup companies are able to provide these job security that the traditional company lacks. Three key features of this. First of all, is that startup companies are inherently small and not at all that easy to fire people. Why is it so? Usually, startup companies are created maybe like 10 or 20 people at most, or even 50 people if your company is really that big for a startup company. What does this mean? Is that this company values each person. Each person have a larger stake in the company. And also, the very nature of startup companies is that they are egalitarian in nature and they use the power of innovation to create new products that are able to attract the money from big investors. Okay, what does this mean? This means that you usually the millennials who partake in these startups are indispensable to the company, and losing them may mean that the company loses someone that is very special and the company might as well just crumble down. But even if you do not buy this argument and you would say that okay, but startup companies are easy die easily because they don't have that much money. Well, uh, the problem is that the skills earned in a startup can be transferred to to other startups. So even if you do not buy this argument, the job security is still there, because why? When you work in a startup and then the startup suddenly dies, your skills do not just magically evaporate overnight. Your skills can still be transferred. So if even if you don't have the money right now, you have the skills to earn a job. And with the high number of startups, you are basically guaranteed a job. This is the kind of job security that we have. Contrast that with traditional companies who are able to fire you because, well, you're new, you're a pawn, and then your skills are usually very, very specific to that company, that more often than not, those skills are not easily transferable to another company. And that is even if you don't buy that, there is the small but very important components of higher job satisfaction, which will be brought by my teammate. For that reasons, we are very proud to propose.
Thank you so much for that speech. We call upon the leader of opposition to open the case for opposition.
Am I audible? Okay, just setting up the timer. I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think opening government biggest mistake is that they never engage with the comparative. The comparative, that what would happen given that startups are very volatile to the market, very easily being left forgotten by the people, especially when you're still a very newly developed startup, then we would question opening government. How then do you guarantee a sustainable job in such an environment that changes constantly, that it's very easily replaced by another startup, for example, in the next year or in the next 2 years, for example, meaning that most probably your job is more unsustainable under opening government side. I'm going to prove 2 things in my speech. Firstly, I'm going to talk about why traditional company have a more stable business model and thus guarantees a more stable job. And secondly, why for long-term sustainability, you get that better under our side of the house. But before that, what we stand for as millennials on-site opening opposition? I think very simply that we would rather work in a traditional company. This looks like Telkomsel, Indofood, government companies, for example, that currently is already established and usually already have a certain business model or certain target that they already have in within short-term and long-term goal, right? Okay, so, but before I move on to my 2 arguments, let's deal with their case one by one. The first thing they said was that you get paid better in this startup. Firstly, I think it's untrue, given that their own characterization is that this is a very newly established startups. Most probably, you don't have that amount of capital, for example, to pay such a high amount, right? Or I think, but secondly, in a more simple logic, is that if you just start working in a company, you also still don't get that high of a pay either, right? So under both sides of the house, if you still start working at that company, you will still get the same amount of wages anyway. I will prove later why in the long run, you will get more wages under our side of the house. The second thing is in terms of that startups care more about their workers and etc., right? I think this is, it simply is not an argument for a startup company, but rather it's based on each and every company that exists, right? So if you are a millennial, given that the perspective of this debate, you will be able to decide which company's environment, for example, that you'd like, and then you can choose that way. So it's not necessarily about startup or not. The environment depends on company and not whether it's startup or a traditional company. But thirdly, which honestly a bizarre argument, is about whether people can transfer their skill. Firstly, it's still very unclear to me what kind of skill that you can transfer from becoming a startup to another startup. I think exactly on the debt side, which requires specific skills, especially in IT and engineering, that to develop their startup better. Under our side, when you work in a traditional company, there are other skills that are actually more transferable. Things like working, meeting with people, for example, meeting customer, going to your job and being disciplined with time, for example. Those are the things that you can learn by working in a traditional company that will make you more able to transfer, whether to go to your future jobs if, let's say, in our worst case scenario, you get laid off, because that is the scenario you want to engage in. Therefore, with that characterization in mind, I'm going to talk about my first argument about the stability of traditional company. The first thing to say in this argument is that we think startup depends its success highly on the image that they are making change, that they are fresh, that they are new, that this is the image that they sell to the public. What does this mean? Firstly, it means they are very easy to lose consumer, especially in sector that is not primary goods. Like how many startups that are currently failing to be sustainable during this pandemic, for example. How many startups that has closed down even when you don't know their names? Don't look at Grab or Gojek. Look at how many people that already start trying to make that new startup, but currently cannot continue because they don't have that support anymore from the public, right? Therefore, we think it's very likely that startups are very easy startups to fail when you, given that startup depends highly on the volatility and support and demand of the people. But the second thing to say here is that I think profit of startup company is highly uncertain. That is to say, startup companies does not get their majority of profit from sales, for example, but they get their profit from selling their data, from advertisement, and etc. Therefore, their main profit does not come instantly, but in a long-term profit that they want to achieve. What this means is that they highly depends on investors, for example, wanting to invest in their company currently. It means they depend on whether there are people who wants to give them capital to start off their startup first. What that means is that it's very easy to fail in that sense when you cannot make the best strategy in order for you to get profit in that way. The comparative under our side is that traditional companies are usually companies that are already established, meaning they already have a proper business model, have a good connection, for example, with other companies and whatnot. Therefore, we see even in this pandemic, a lot more traditional companies are actually surviving compared to startups that is losing their hands. Therefore, the conclusion of this first point is that startup is highly risky, and thus, as millennial, we don't want to go in such jobs that is very prone to us from being not having a job at the end of the day. Two, let's talk about sustainability in the perspective of in the long run. One, I think startup is very dynamic and follow the trends of the market. Therefore, one, I think leaders are very easily to be changed in startup company. When leaders cannot make that change that is needed, for example, to cater to the consumer base, I think it's very likely that those leaders are changed. Thus, those subordinates at the bottom is also very likely to be changed. But okay, sure. Even if, let's say, the leaders are not changed, these startup companies also demand workers to be creative, to be innovative in a sense. That's when you get promotion in that way. Therefore, if you, let's say, which is innovation is based on your luck, right? Based on whether your idea is accepted or not, whether that is public accept your idea and whatnot, right? So promotion in that sense, promotion based on luck rather than whether you are loyal to the company or whether you have worked for so long. What's the comparative on our side of the house? The first is, I think, working in this traditional company guaranteed you a job for a long run. For example, there is also pension money, there is job security, and etc., which I think laws forces this traditional company to adhere to, but does not force startup company to adhere to. But two, and most importantly, promotion on our side is almost a guaranteed thing, especially when you already work in that company for a long time. Therefore, given that maybe the same time amount that they spend on site opening up from working in a startup company, you already get a promotion as a manager in a bank, for example, or in a food company. Therefore, we think it's much better under our side when you can at least guarantee a job in the long run when the condition is uncertain. We are the side that guarantees you have a job, guarantees that you are sustainable, and guarantees that you ensure for the long run. We're so proud to oppose.
Thank you so much for that speech. We call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to conclude the case of side government. Here.
Wait, sorry, tadi baterai
Yes,
tabletnya.
no worries. Yeah, no worries.
Udah siap?
Yes, we can hear you clearly.
Okay. The opposition side of the House made a very simple analysis of what a startup company is. They said that startup company needs coders. Two responses to this. First, it is not true. You can, from electrical engineering degree, make a vape. Or, for example, if you are in a biology company like 23andMe, you need statisticians and a biologist in order to make that kind of company. And secondly, even if you have to code, it is an easy and accessible skill that you can have for a free 8-week course to land a job in a company, which the parameter is millennials, means they are still liability free. They usually don't have families starting young. That means they can have more risk that they can receive at the end of the day to learn this kind of skills. But other than that, I have 4 rebuttals towards the opposition side of the house. The first one, they talk about how in a changing market, they need a stable job. But here's the problem and analysis that they never tackle, which is fintech companies are killing jobs. And currently, if you are an accountant in a certain companies, which is not a startup company, you only have one trade, which is being an accountant for a very specialized division that usually raises your memory of all the other basic skills that you can use in accounting for that very specialized department. And it is true if you stretch it for engineering, for example, or as a statistics. Secondly, the second rebuttal talks about that startups don't have much money to provide stability. First off, they gain investor to get money. And secondly, I will explain to you why necessarily not having that kind of money and having that kind of scarcity of your company might fail at any time gives you the confidence, gives you the capability to mitigate your economies better, right? Third rebuttal talking about how a working job working job in a big companies gives job discipline. This is an exclusive argument that we have also, and it's actually better on our side, which in startup you have a bargaining chip in entering a startup, which is usually because startup don't pay as much as better, you are usually given a percentage stake that used to bargain on that company, that you would short it or go long if the company messes around with you. So it's better on our job because they understand, as millennials understand how job works, how it's not about the company itself using them, but how they can mutually benefit from the kind of job they're working. Fourth rebuttal is talking about depending on an investor, it's easy to fail. But this is a wrong assertion from the opposition side of the house. Investors have the experience in creating companies and they don't want their investment to fail. The companies that have invested $20 million, they would invest more if the company are in trouble. They usually provide consultants and provide more money so that the startups and the people and the founders and the workers usually have a better comprehensive understanding of how the industry works. So in my extension later, I will explain to you how they can apply it in making new startups, or if the startup go bankrupt, they can easily get a job in another startup. Okay, another rebuttal, the fifth one, they talk about pension money on their side. It provides them safety. But here's the thing. First, pension, this allows people to change profession in the long run, and it gives a false sense of security, which I will explain later, why in a statistic, it will be shown that people who makes their own job or work to earn less actually takes better care of their money. So two extensions. First, it is more sustainable. First, startup gives individuals who works there knows how to operate the business. For example, everyone in PayPal, when it was a startup, understood all the basic laws, all the basic business, and all the basic engineering and design in order to make their company, because the number of people are very small and they don't want any additional expenses. What they do is they use the other members to have the kind of learning curve at the end of the day. Secondly, they can make new business or work for other startups if they're fired from the company, if the company go bankrupt or being sold. For example, every PayPal founders and early engineers who doesn't have a business degree made other startups, and all of them, even the non-stakeholders. Thirdly, startup founders and workers maintain money better than the working class in established company. In status quo, big company gives the feeling of security or having a stable future. And that's one of the things that provides you the statistical analysis on usually no matter how much money that you make at the end of the day, you still go from paycheck to paycheck, even if you earn 5,000 or 1,000 or $300 a month because you think that it is stable. But what happens when you get replaced by fintech companies, or you get executed, is usually you already spend it on the kind of big housings. Comparatively, if you work on a startup, usually you have the scarcity of this might work or this might not. I have to save money in order to make another one or work in another startup. So startups are a way to develop skills for you. No thanks. To have a more sustainable living with the risk aversion implemented in your life. Comparatively, in big companies, when you are fired, your skills are way too specialized. You're unlikely to learn something new to make business and replace, and less likely to get hired. And you get the feeling of monetary security that increases your spending. In our side of the house, with the skill diversified, after you being successful or the company being bankrupt, you can make another companies or work for other startups, because it's a volatile industry, and you take better care of the money, and you take better care of the education that you have gained from working from one company. Second extension, it gives more satisfaction. First, working in startup requires higher learning curve than in established company. Examples, learn to engineer but also manage money and to design at the same time in PayPal, for example. Comparatively, in big companies, their skills are very specialized. You cannot see an economist or an engineers whose work are interchangeable. Secondly, learning and volatile working gives you more satisfaction. In the flow theory by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, repeating a job that you already know gives you a dull sense of living. Even if the job offers better level, for example, you get promoted to management, firstly, it's very unlikely. And secondly, after you already establish your position as a manager, usually you don't learn much anymore, and you still get that kind of dull sense of living. And so in our case, working in startup gives you more satisfaction in life by giving you more problems to tackle and new things to learn. Because of that, as a millennial, we think that it's better for us to work in a startup than to work in big companies. Because of that, we believe that this motion shall stand. Thank you.
Thank you for that speech. To conclude the side of opposition, we call upon the deputy leader of opposition.
Am I audible?
Yes, all good.
Okay. Okay, I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think, oh wait, salah timer. Okay, I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think opening government here work on a case-per-case basis and example-based analysis on how they put this kind of example, then they claim that this example is good. This looks like what they claim about, investors do not want their investment to fail. They explain about, oh yeah, you need this kind of company paycheck to paycheck, but we don't get any necessary explanation why working in startup is necessarily more better than working in traditional company, because we don't get any comparative, and the only comparative that exists in them is a comparative that is very false to begin with. One clarification that serves also as a rebuttal. I think that we need to clarify first what kind of skill that you learn in startup and what kind of skill that you learn in traditional company. Solomon want to claim that you learn a lot of things that is important in startup that can actually transfer to another startup. So this clarification serves as rebuttal. Why? Note that when you go to startup, what startup want is that startup want a specialized skill for you to actually improve your company as fast as possible. Because startup work on a very time-sensitive basis where you need to actually get profit as soon as possible. Why is that the case? Because most startup, money burning first. They lose a lot of money first and not gaining any income whatsoever in the early year due to they want to disrupt the market first that exists within the society. This is what we look with Gojek, no thank you, and Grab that literally still losing money and not getting any profit whatsoever. What does it mean? It means that the only, no thank you, the member that they want to have is the member that really specializes in those kind of things. That means that you need to learn something like you only learn coding, for example, or you only learn about app design or UI interface, or you only learn about front-end or back end, for example, so on and so forth. This is something that cannot be transferred to another startup, because in another startup, you might not be replaced with the same position that you have. Or maybe in another startup, they need something else that is actually relevant with their startup. Comparatively to traditional company, you work on the teamwork basis that literally traditional company have. You work as an average employee, for example, that need a soft skill like communication skill, for example, spreadsheet, PowerPoint, or something like that. That is a general skill that you can transfer to one another in this kind of in this one company to another, right? Meaning that in terms of what you learn, we think that it's much better in traditional company, because the skill that you will have will something that can be given to another places, for example, so on and so forth. Several rebuttals. Firstly, basically their claim is that traditional company is very tangible and very actually harm with the international political turmoil that happened. Two rebuttals. One, no. Usually big traditional company have budget management or facing this kind of turmoil. That's why they hire a specialist agent to actually just monitor this kind of, international political turmoil, for example, manage their salary or budget so they are not being disrupted when that kind of thing happen. Secondly, note that startup also hampered by this kind of international turmoil, because usually this kind of politic and turmoil also affect the general society that happen in that access on the ground, that literally also in the consumer of startup, meaning that the accessibility of citizen will also be hampered with the international turmoil that happen. Hence, startup will also affected to this kind of thing. Thirdly, note that who invests startup to begin with, right? This also traditional and private company that's actually want also to gain profit, meaning that when traditional company hampered, startup also hampered in this kind of case scenario. Second rebuttal, when they talk about job security, right? They want to claim about general shift of automation, so on and so forth. This argument cannot be count, because automation recently and always been happen only to labor worker that literally cannot work in a startup company. Why is that the case? Because no, thank you. Because note that automation usually happen to something that is very easy to work on, like packaging shoes, for example, and so on and so forth. Which I don't get why opening government claim that this kind of person able to go to startup that literally need you to actually learn something more than only work something that is very easy to do, for example, so on and so forth. Secondly, even if this kind of thing happen, it's just only a fear mongering in opening government, because we don't think that automation happens so fast within the status quo, right? We're literally talking about Industrial Revolution 4.0 5 to 10 years ago. Until now, it's never been applied anyway, and the development is just very small to begin with, right? Meaning that it's very unlikely to happen, and if it is happen, it's happened in a very long-term basis that we cannot talk about in this debate, right? Next thing, they want to claim that startup is very small. That means they will be egalitarian and to actually serve their kind of workers, so on and so forth, right? Then if it is not, they're able to just move out move out to another job, for example, so on and so forth. Several responses. First, I think that we need to also characterize what kind of stigma and what kind of notion that these kind of millennials actually facing within the status quo. We think that millennials also face stigma, like loyalty to a certain job. For example, when you move one job to another, you will be stigmatized as someone is actually not successful because you are changing your work every day, for example. This is the notion that we always face with our parents, for example, with our teachers, so on and so forth. When we say, oh yeah, last week I worked in this A company and this week I work in the B company, so on and so forth, what we get is a stigma that, oh, why are you changing jobs, so on and so forth? Will not be successful for you. This is why it's very harmful, because even if benefit happen that is money that government want to have, the stigma that will be access to this kind of millennials will just cut out the benefit of this kind of money, because they are being oppressed mentally by their parents, by their surrounding, by telling them that no, your job is not sustainable because you're always changing your job, so on and so forth, right? But secondly, not that wage-wise, changing job is much more will be much more less than you work loyally with just one traditional company. Because usually in the nature of traditional company is that if you loyal and work on a long-term basis, you'll eventually get promotion, you will get tunjangan, for example, that literally can work a tons when you work more than 5 years, for example, so on and so forth, right? Comparatively, when you're changing job in startup, what you get is just the wage that is literally need to be minimum, because startup does not have those lots of money to begin with. Like someone want to claim that there is investor, for example, but those kind of investor money is just for to cover up and getting break-even point, so that startup is not losing a lot of money to begin with. Like what I claim to you, that startup is actually losing money at the very first place, right? Meaning that the wage and salary that you will get in the startup in if you're changing job, eventually it just will be a minimum. It will be just very low comparatively if you work long term in a certain company. Meaning that in the long term scenario, it will be much better for you to stick to only one job in traditional company that can literally give you a tons like tunjangan loyalty, for example, so on and so forth, right? Meaning that at the end of the day, what you will get in opening a position, one, sustainability of wage, and will be increasingly, it will be sustainably increasing within time. What you get in government is just you unstable market of this kind of startup that literally work on a mass market disruption, where the booming of writing startup in 2015 literally break down a lot of startup in the timeline, for example, so on and so forth. Meaning that if you want sustainability for millennials, you should go to opposition. Proud to oppose.
All right. Thank you so much for the debate. Once again, we thank Telkom Indonesia for sponsoring JOVED, and we hope that this debate is satisfactory. Thank you.